we were in the middle of talking about yesterday when we wrapped up was how part of the dynamic of post-war America and the Cold War was the second Red Scare, where for a second time there is this hysterical fear of what? Of communism, and this, hysterical searching for communists and suspicion of spies and suspecting that communists are trying to infiltrate America. A lot of people just became obsessed with that concept throughout the 1950s, and that whole association with communism is still, even in a world like today where communism no longer has it still around, of course, but no longer the kind of presence that it had, anywhere near what it had during the Cold War. It still kind of, creates a sense of suspicion amongst a lot of Americans today. And that, fear was incredibly heightened by the early to mid 1950s. We mentioned yesterday those high-profile spy cases like Alger Hiss and the Rosenberg. So people, because of those things, were particularly concerned that there were spies in their midst, and that you couldn't, where were they, and who could you trust, and all of that. That led eventually to the rise and the fall of this person, of Joseph McCarthy. Many of you probably heard of McCarthy, or McCarthyism. Gets a whole kind of ism named after him because of his exploits and his preying upon those fears. Joseph McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin, I want to say. And he starts out his career as a rather undistinguished senator, not very, very well known, pretty obscure. No one really knew who he was. He had not done hardly much to make too much of a name for himself outside of his home state. But he rises to national prominence very quickly by making all of these accusations about there being communists in the government. He preys upon those fears and starts branding himself as this anti-communist crusader, and starts making all these eventually completely wild accusations that there are hundreds of communists in the State Department. Is the first kind of area that he accused. He claims to have lists of actual names of people. He's never able to produce any of this stuff or any evidence as to where it came from, but he goes around and then it just kind of keeps going from there, making all these lists that there's communists in the State Department, that there's communists working in this part of the government, that part of the government, all sorts of things. And at first, that got him a lot of support. It makes him pretty famous. A lot of folks saw him as, a hero, as someone that was going after the evil communists that were infiltrating the government. He was, attacking the institutions, and he was, fighting for America and all those kind of things. But it just starts getting, or maybe even, sooner than as quickly as it started, it just starts getting hysterical. It starts to get insane. It starts to get where he is just making accusations and pointing fingers wherever he possibly can, with no evidence, with no, information at all. And if someone even tries to call him out on it and say, well, where did you get this? He immediately starts accusing those people. It literally becomes a witch hunt. That was a common phrase and continues to be used for McCarthy's campaign. The similarities to this, and if you think back to the Salem witch trials that we talked about last year, the similarities is uncanny. If you remember with that whole thing, all these crazy accusations of witchcraft, and it seemed like once you were accused, what could you really do? Pretty much nothing. To be accused was pretty much to be guilty. There really wasn't much you could do to clear your name. And that led to not just McCarthy doing this. This was happening in a lot of areas of the country, but something called blacklisting. And blacklisting was not new to this situation. This has been done in other situations and in other circumstances before. But it becomes very problematic in the, or really quite a phenomenon during the second Red Scare. Blacklisting is when people, they were blacklisted. It means like your name is put on this, it's a figurative thing. It's not a literal list. But in this case, you're labeled as a communist, so you are blacklisted. And that would mean that you're not going to get hired. You may be fired from your job. You're like on this sort of, not literal, but a figurative list as being a known communist, and it ruined your reputation. You know, it ruins your reputation, potentially ruins your career. People don't want to associate with you. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people that were blacklisted because of this. You know, there wasn't enough evidence to, first of all, you know, being a communist isn't against the law. You have to remember that. You know, it's free speech is protected. So even if someone was associated, and there were plenty of cases of people that may have at some point kind of flirted with ideas of communism or been members of communist associated associations or the Communist Party, likely before World War II. But, you know, we're no longer involved or only got involved a little bit or whatever. But again, it's not illegal. You couldn't prosecute people for just being communists. You know, it's not like they're automatically spies or something, but people would assume that they were. And then they would get blacklisted, and then they might lose their job, lose their reputation, so forth and so on. And so a lot of people's lives were ruined by all of this, not just by McCarthy, but again, this was happening in lots of different industries. It was very present in the entertainment industry. A lot of actors, it was a big thing in Hollywood where they were just purging in the 1950s. A lot of actors and actresses getting blacklisted for potential involvement, or they knew somebody that was involved, and a lot of people's lives and careers being ruined. The McCarthy thing eventually reaches a peak because just like the Salem witch trials, you know, centuries before, eventually it gets so hysterical that people start to, you know, realize what's really going on, and they start to question more McCarthy's methods and starting to question the fact that he never seems to have any sort of evidence. He never, always just making these baseless claims, and it just kind of comes out of nowhere. And eventually McCarthy takes it too far, kind of starts accusing the wrong people. And accusing, you know, and making accusations that he simply cannot support. It all comes to a head when he starts making accusations about communists in the army, and that they were communists in certain part, like the Signal Corps or something, and then just kind of going higher and higher. And the army officials and army lawyers accused him back of just making those attacks for baseless reasons. And so all of that, because you had these conflicting accusations, the Senate decided to investigate it. So you had these hearings, these televised hearings, as they were investigating McCarthy's accusations against the Army, and the Army, of course, trying to defend themselves against McCarthy's baseless accusations to which he had absolutely no evidence. And it was on TV. TV was a new thing in these days, but by this time was something that, you know, most people had in their homes, and they were covering it, you know, all day, these hearings. And this is where McCarthy really starts to lose that popularity, where he's really kind of exposed for what he was. People were horrified at his just baseless accusations and his constant deflecting. You know, whenever they would pressure him about evidence and produce this, and he keeps saying, you have this list of names, where is it? He would just deflect it and say, you know, well, I heard that your next door neighbor's a communist or something crazy like that. And eventually, you know, like I said, people just seeing him for what he was. This little clip right here I'm going to play, this is one of the more dramatic and more famous exchanges in the McCarthy hearings. And you'll see McCarthy, I'll show it to you. And the guy that he's exchanging with was a lawyer for the Army that has asked, and I think he's already asked it when this clip starts, it's about 4 or 5 minutes, you know, demanded that he turn over this list of names. Well, McCarthy, of course, doesn't have the list of names, so he starts starts talking about this guy, a young guy that works in that lawyer's office, and accusing him of being involved with, you'll hear him call it the Lawyers Guild, which supposedly had some communist ties. And then the Army lawyer just kind of loses his mind and just kind of lays into McCarthy and gives a really famous line. So let's take a look at this and just see how McCarthy just kind of looks down, and he just keeps on deflecting. And he just keeps on trying to come up with more accusations and more people to accuse.
May I say that Mr. Wells talks about
That's the Army lawyer.
Reckless.
That's McCarthy with
He
the glasses.
he has been dating Mr. Cohen here for hours, requesting that Mr. Cohen before sundown get out of any department of the government anyone who was serving the communist cause. Now, I just give this man's record, And I want to say, Mr. Welch, that it has been labeled long before he became a member, as early as 1944.
Senator, maybe not a problem. We know he belongs to lighter. You know, and Mr. Cole nodded his head at me. I did you, I think, no personal injury, Mr. Cole. I meant to do you no personal injury. And if I did, I beg your pardon. Let us not assassinate this lad first, Senator. Look, you look down and down. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know the truth, Mr. Welch.
I'll say it.
I say, Mr. Chairman, I can find a personal person. I'd like to finish this.
Senator, I think it hurts you too, sir.
I'd like to finish this. I know Mr. Cohen would rather not have you go into this. I intend to, however, and Mr. Welch talks about any sense of decency. It seems that Mr. Welch is pained so deeply, he thinks it's improper for me to give the record, the Communist Front record, of a man whom he wanted to foist upon this committee. But it doesn't pain him at all. There's no pain in his chest about the attempt to destroy the reputation and they take the jobs away from the young men who are working in my committee. And Mr. Welch, if I have said anything here which is untrue, then tell me. I have heard you and everyone else talk so much about laying the truth upon the table that when I heard the completely phony Mr. Welch, I've listened to you now for a long time, to say now before sundown, you must get these people out of government. And I just want to have it very clear that you were not so serious about that when you tried to recommend this man to this committee. But the point is, Chair, I'd like to say again that you do not believe what I'm about recommending you. Probably for this committee, because you had to do your job. All the recommendations that were made, and not because any of them coming from Mr. Welch. I would include. Okay, follow me up, Mr. Welch. You brought him down, did you not? To access here, so. Mr. McCarthy, I will not discuss this further with you. You have sat within 6 feet of me and could have asked me about Fred Fisher. You have seen fit to bring it out, and if there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. I will not discuss it further. I will not ask Mr. Cole any more witnesses. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, call the next witness.
So you see, he sort of done with you kind of thing. That became a famous line from all that. That have you no sense of decency, like you really will stop at nothing. You will just say whatever you want. In the end, not only did that bring about, a public opinion of McCarthy that he was making up stuff, he was a liar, he was doing baseless accusations. This eventually resulted in McCarthy even being censured by the United States Senate. A censure is like, the Senate does have the power to expel its members. A censure is like the worst thing they could do out before that or without actually expelling them. So it's like condemnation. It's like the most harsh, the most significant shame on you that they can do to one of their own members. And it pretty much, if somebody gets censured, it pretty much just discredits them. And they would have a hard time recovering from that. And McCarthy does not recover from that. And he dies actually a few years after all of this, so it leads to his own downfall. And if anything, McCarthyism becomes not just synonymous with this hunt for communists, and it also becomes that the name itself just sort of becomes a synonym for any kind of baseless accusations, any kind of investigation where people are making baseless accusations, where they're using unfair evidence, where they're using unfair tactics. McCarthyism. That is ultimately what his name becomes to be associated with, not with so much hunting down true communists or threats or spies, but of, chasing people unfairly, ruining people's lives, and making up stuff. So the Red Scare leads to, in some cases, significant violations of people's civil rights and civil liberties. All right, so questions on that much?